On the morning of November 25, 1487, Westminster Abbey became something more than stone and stained glass. It turned into a message loud, deliberate, impossible to misunderstand. Elizabeth of York walked beneath those ancient arches not as a bride standing in a king's shadow, not as a silent emblem stitched onto a banner, but as a queen being crowned in her own right. And that detail matters because in England it almost never happened. A queen consort usually didn't get her own coronation. If the king was already crowned, his wife simply became queen when the marriage vows were spoken. No extra ceremony, no separate spotlight, no public declaration. Yet here was Elizabeth receiving exactly that, her own lavish, carefully staged coronation, heavy with symbolism, staged at precisely the right moment for precisely the right reason. If you want to understand why, you have to remember what England had just survived. Decades of bloodshed, family against family, loyalties shifting like sand, and crowns changing hands through violence more often than inheritance. Elizabeth's marriage to Henry VIII in January 1486 wasn't simply romantic, and it wasn't meant to be. It was a political hinge, a locked door finally being forced shut. She was York, he was Lancaster. Their union was supposed to stitch the country back together, to end the Wars of the Roses by merging the two claims into one future. And in that sense, it worked. Elizabeth would become the mother and later the grandmother of every Tudor monarch who followed, all the way down to 1603. But that smooth summary hides the far stranger truth. Elizabeth's life was shaped by power she rarely controlled, yet she stood at the center of it all. She was the prize everyone needed, the link everyone chased, the person whose very existence could steady a throne or threaten one. What must it have felt like to be her? To be raised as royalty, to be promised to one great future, then yanked into another, then pulled into yet another by storms she never summoned. To watch her brother taken, her family torn open, her world rewritten by men who claimed it was all necessary. To be at once central and helpless. This is the story of Elizabeth of York, and if you enjoy stories like this, make sure to like, share, and subscribe to Profileverse. Elizabeth of York was born on February 11, 1466 at Westminster Palace, just west of the City of London as it existed then. Her arrival should have been a celebration of certainty. A king's first daughter born into a household that believed, at least for a moment, that its hold on England was secure. Her father was Edward IV, King of England and Lord of Ireland, a man who had taken the crown by force and then held it through sharp instincts and sharper steel. Her mother was Elizabeth Woodville, a woman whose very marriage to the king had already shaken the foundations of expectation. Because Elizabeth Woodville was not what England's political world considered appropriate. Kings of England were expected to marry into foreign royal houses or the most senior noble families, sealing alliances in the way monarchs always had. Edward's decision to marry Elizabeth Woodville in 1464 quietly, controversially, was extraordinary. She was widely regarded as a commoner, even if her lineage on her mother Jacquetta's side connected her to the rulers of Luxembourg. The match brought love or desire into a space where strategy normally ruled, and it created enemies that never forgot the insult. Elizabeth was the first child of that marriage, and she was named after her mother, as if Edward were daring the court to challenge the choice. More children followed, 9 more down to 1480, though 2 died in infancy, as so many did. Elizabeth also had 2 half-brothers from her mother's first marriage to Sir John Grey. She grew up surrounded by siblings, wet nurses, ladies-in-waiting, priests, tutors, servants, and the constant quiet awareness that everything she touched belonged to the crown. The walls were rich, the clothes were fine, the ceremonies were endless, but behind it all sat the unspoken truth of her era. Royal children were born into a life of politics long before they could understand the word. Elizabeth belonged to the House of York, one of the greatest aristocratic lines in England, though its rise to the throne was still fresh when she was born. The roots of York stretched back to Edward III, the long-reigning king who had shaped England's medieval power. Edward III and Philippa of Hainault had 13 children, 8 were sons and 5 lived into adulthood. Those sons became the seeds of competing claims, and the echoes of their bloodlines would eventually split the country open. Edward the Black Prince was the eldest, but he died before his father. His son became Richard II in 1377, still a child, growing into a king only slowly while England's nobility watched him closely and judged every move. The other sons, Lionel, Duke of Clarence, John of Gaunt, Duke of Lancaster, Edmund of Langley, Duke of York, and Thomas, Duke of Gloucester, formed branches that could never fully stop reaching toward power. Elizabeth descended from Edmund of Langley, the Duke of York. Edmund was her great-great-grandfather. That made Elizabeth the great-great-great-granddaughter of Edward III, a detail that mattered intensely in an age where blood was legitimacy and lineage was law. Under normal circumstances, the line of the 4th adult son would never have become a serious contender for the throne. But England rarely respected normal circumstances for long. In 1399, Richard II was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke, the son of John of Gaunt. Bolingbroke became Henry IV, and the House of Lancaster took the throne. Some historians see that seizure as the first tremor of what later became the Wars of the Roses, because once a crown is taken by force, it becomes something that can be taken again. At first, the Lancastrian kings held on well. Henry VII's reign especially saw England at the height of its campaign against France in the 100 Years' War. But Henry VIII died in 1422, only 35, carried off by dysentery while still campaigning. His heir, Henry VI, was an infant. An infant king is not a ruler. He is a symbol held up by men who claim to rule in his name while pursuing their own interests. England entered a period of regencies and councils, dominated by powerful uncles like John, Duke of Bedford, and Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester. When those stabilizing figures died, the balance shifted. Power drifted toward the Beaufort cousins, descendants of John of Gaunt's relationship with Catherine Swynford. The English war effort in France collapsed. Then in 1453, Henry VI suffered a psychological breakdown that left him incapable of ruling effectively. That vacuum is where Elizabeth's grandfather, Richard of York, stepped forward as a leader of opposition, a man powerful enough, royal enough, and furious enough to challenge the state of things. The clash turned violent. On May 22, 1455, the First Battle of St. Albans erupted, one of those moments where you can almost feel the country tipping into disaster. Richard of York and his allies defeated a Lancastrian force led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset. Richard was made Lord Protector, effectively the head of government, while Henry VI drifted in and out of competence. For a few years, England lived in a tense, uneasy compromise. But compromise doesn't last in a world that treats war as negotiation. By 1459, open conflict resumed. Elizabeth's father, Edward, was 17 then, and when Richard of York was killed at Wakefield on December 30, 1460, leadership passed to the young Edward. What followed was the kind of rise that history loves: bold, violent, almost cinematic. In early 1461, Edward won decisive victories at Mortimer's Cross and Towton, then claimed the throne before his 19th birthday. He became Edward IV. The Lancastrian cause survived, but York now wore the crown. So when Elizabeth was born 5 years later, she was not the daughter of a duke, she was the daughter of a king. And yet, for all the grandeur surrounding her, Elizabeth remains strangely quiet in the sources. Very few letters survive in her own hand. Her voice rarely reaches us directly. Instead, we rebuild her life through chronicles and records, through histories like Polydore Virgil's Anglica Historia, written during Henry VII's reign, or the Crowland Chronicle maintained by the Benedictine monks of Crowland. We glimpse her through wardrobe accounts and household spending, through lists of purchases, payments, ceremonies. It's a patchwork portrait, vivid in outline, hazy in intimacy. She was christened at Westminster Abbey. Her sponsors included Edward's formidable mother, Cecily Neville, Dowager Duchess of York, and Elizabeth Woodville's mother, Jacquetta of Luxembourg. Her maternal grandfather, Richard Woodville, would likely have been present too. She grew up in royal residences, Westminster, Windsor, moving as the court moved, surrounded by servants trained to treat her as precious and political all at once. And before she was even old enough to truly understand her own name, her future was already being traded like a treaty. By the winter of 1469, when Elizabeth was not yet 4, she was betrothed to George Neville, the son of John Neville, Marquess of Montagu. The Nevilles were not merely powerful, they were dangerous. They had shaped the Wars of the Roses as kingmakers. Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, had become so influential that history remembers him as the kingmaker itself. Edward IV understood what that meant. He needed the Nevilles close, bound by blood and promise, because families like that didn't simply serve a king. They evaluated him, they tolerated him, and if he disappointed them, they replaced him. Betrothing children so young was common in that era. It didn't mean an immediate marriage. It was a claim on the future, a binding thread meant to prevent betrayal. In anticipation of the match, 5-year-old George Neville was made Duke of Bedford. The gesture was clear. Edward was offering the Nevilles royal proximity, royal privilege, royal legitimacy. And Elizabeth, too young to read, too young to reason, was already a piece on the board. But the board shifted violently. The Wars of the Roses had not truly ended in 1461. Lancastrian leaders still lurked abroad, slipping into Scotland or fleeing to the continent, looking for allies and openings. There were skirmishes throughout the 1460s as they tested Yorkist strength. Henry VI was captured, but his wife Margaret of Anjou and their son Edward of Westminster remained free, rallying resistance wherever they could. Then, in 1470, the unthinkable happened. The Nevilles turned. Warwick never forgave Edward IV for marrying Elizabeth Woodville, secretly without consulting him, elevating a woman Warwick didn't choose. Pride and power collided. Warwick and his allies marched on London and restored Henry VIII to the throne in what became known as the Redemption. Edward IV fled to the continent, gathering supporters like a man gathering breath before a plunge. He returned in 1471, and the violence that followed was the kind that resets a dynasty. On April 14, 1471, Edward won a crushing victory at Barnet. Warwick was killed. John Neville, the father of Elizabeth's proposed husband, was killed as well. 3 weeks later, Edward of Westminster died at Tewkesbury. And not long after that, Henry VIII was dead too, almost certainly murdered. Edward IV reclaimed his throne and demolished the Lancastrian leadership with a severity meant to end the war forever. In the aftermath, Elizabeth's betrothal to George Neville became pointless. The alliance it was designed to secure had collapsed. The marriage was quietly abandoned, another future erased before Elizabeth was old enough to mourn it. As the 1470s unfolded, Elizabeth grew into adolescence in the royal households. We don't know the precise shape of her education, but she would have learned what royal girls were expected to learn: piety, courtly behavior, household management, the art of appearing serene while men argued over her future. The Renaissance ideal of deeply educated noble daughters, promoted by figures like Thomas More, would flourish later in the 16th century. Still, Elizabeth would not have been ignorant. Those around her would have ensured she could read, understand devotional texts, manage accounts, recognize ceremonial protocol, and carry herself like a princess in a world that judged women by composure as much as by blood. And while her domestic life stays faint in the record, her political value becomes sharper with every year. By the mid-1470s, Edward IV felt more secure. The Lancastrians seemed finally crushed. He turned outward again, toward Ireland and France, trying to reshape England's position in Europe. In 1474, he renewed England's alliance with Burgundy through the Treaty of London. In 1475, he invaded northern France, expecting Burgundian support that never fully arrived. Louis XI of France, wary, clever, allergic to unnecessary war, moved quickly to negotiate. On August 29, 1475, the Treaty of Picquigny was signed. And once again, Elizabeth became ink on a page. The treaty promised peace, payments, and a marriage alliance. Louis's son and heir, the future Charles VIII, would marry Elizabeth when they were old enough. Charles was younger than Elizabeth, only 5 in 1475, so this was another long-term promise, another thread stretched into the future. And the contract revealed how brutally interchangeable royal daughters could be. If Elizabeth died before the marriage, her sister Mary would take her place. One girl or another, York's blood either way. The deal mattered more than the person. In the end, neither Elizabeth nor Mary married Charles. Politics shifted. France turned toward the rising power of the Habsburgs, who had inherited Burgundian territories and now loomed on France's eastern frontier. Charles ultimately married Anne of Brittany instead. Elizabeth's French future dissolved like mist, but there was an even more immediate reason the match collapsed. Edward IV died unexpectedly on April 9, 1483, at only 42. At first, the succession seemed manageable. He had children, including a son, Edward V, but Edward V was 12. England had seen what a child king could mean. The plan was straightforward on paper. Edward's uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, would serve as protector until the boy came of age. It should have been simple. It became catastrophic. Richard moved with startling speed. Edward V and his brother Richard of Shrewsbury were taken into the Tower of London, officially for their protection, in reality for control. Not long after, they disappeared. Historians overwhelmingly agree the boys were murdered, and the shadow of that crime has never lifted. Richard seized the crown and became Richard III, justifying the usurpation with a legal claim that Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville was invalid, supposedly because Edward had previously been contracted to Lady Eleanor Butler. If the marriage was invalid, the children were illegitimate. If the children were illegitimate, Richard's claim could be framed as rightful. It was a cold, technical argument built to cover a violent reality. Elizabeth Woodville responded by fleeing into sanctuary at Westminster Abbey with her remaining children, including Elizabeth. Sanctuary was sacred, even for a king like Richard. Storming a church to drag out a widow and her daughters would have been seen as a violation not just of law but of God. So they stayed there inside the walls of Westminster, surrounded by prayer and fear, while England adjusted itself to a new ruler. Inside that sanctuary, Elizabeth became a center of intrigue. Supporters of the late Edward IV looked at her and saw possibility. The Crowland Chronicle suggests plans were considered to smuggle the family out and take them to the continent, making them the heartbeat of resistance. Whether those plans were real or practical is unclear, but the fact they were whispered at all shows how dangerous Elizabeth's existence had become. In the spring of 1484, Richard persuaded the family to leave sanctuary. He promised safety. He promised advantageous marriages for Elizabeth and her sisters. One proposed match for Elizabeth was even floated with Prince Manuel of Portugal, the future king, though like so many plans around her, it never became real. Promises again were easy. Security was not. Then came 1485, and with it a new set of rumors that clung to Elizabeth like smoke. On March 16, 1485, Richard III's wife, Anne Neville, died, likely of tuberculosis. Almost immediately, whispers spread that Richard had poisoned her and intended to marry Elizabeth herself. The rumor fit the mood of the time, because once a king is believed capable of murdering nephews, people will believe him capable of anything. Politically, the idea had a kind of logic. If Richard married his brother's eldest daughter, he would absorb the Yorkist claim into his own line, neutralizing the danger she represented. And yet the match was deeply problematic even by medieval standards. Marrying one's niece was not ordinary. It would have required a papal dispensation. It would have risked disgust and rebellion. On balance, the rumor was likely just that, a rumor. It would have been far easier for Richard to marry her off to a foreign prince and send her far from England, far from loyalists, far from the possibility that her blood could rally opposition. But Elizabeth's fate was about to be decided elsewhere, by men gathering strength beyond England's borders. For years, ever since the re-emergence and death of Henry VIII, another figure with a claim, however fragile, had been living in exile. Henry Tudor had spent his youth in Brittany in the uncertain safety of foreign courts. He was the son of Edmund Tudor, Earl of Richmond, and Margaret Beaufort. His claim to the throne was complicated, and it mattered most through his mother. Margaret descended from John of Gaunt through the Beaufort line, children born out of wedlock, later legitimized, with the added condition that they could not claim the throne. But civil war has a way of reopening closed doors. In the chaos of shifting legitimacy, people began to look at Henry Tudor as an acceptable alternative, especially when Richard III's reign became synonymous with suspicion and fear. After Richard seized power and the princes vanished, opponents of his rule drifted toward Henry, gathering around the idea of a new claim because they needed anything that could stand against Richard's crown. In late summer 1485, Henry crossed to Wales with a small force and marched into England. On August 22, 1485, he met Richard's army at Bosworth Field. Richard was killed in battle. Henry Tudor took the crown and became Henry VIII. And suddenly the question became unavoidable. What would happen to Elizabeth of York? Even her location at the moment Bosworth was fought is uncertain. But the new king moved quickly to control her, not out of cruelty but out of necessity. He placed her in the household of his mother, Margaret Beaufort, along with other politically sensitive children, Edward Stafford, the young Duke of Buckingham, and Edward, Earl of Warwick, another boy whose blood could become a banner for rebellion. These were living claims, living threats, living leverage. From the beginning, many expected Henry to marry Elizabeth. It wasn't only romance, it was arithmetic. England had been torn by rival claims, and Henry's claim alone was not enough to calm the country. Parliament convened on November 7, 1485, and quickly declared Henry the legitimate king. They annulled Richard III's legislation attacking the legitimacy of Edward IV's children. With that done, the Speaker of the House of Commons urged Henry to marry Elizabeth. The Lords echoed him. The message was clear: unite York and Lancaster or risk war all over again. Henry agreed. The wedding was arranged swiftly. On January 18, 1486, Henry XXVIII married Elizabeth XIX. The union was meant to fuse the surviving claims into a single dynasty, the House of Tudor. Henry had already been crowned on October 30, 1485, strengthening his legal position immediately after taking power. That is why Elizabeth's coronation came later, separate, and why its timing mattered so much. Her coronation finally took place on November 25, 1487, 22 months after the wedding. The delay was unusual, but there were reasons. First, the marriage required papal approval in the form of a dispensation from Pope Innocent VII, since Henry and Elizabeth were related within prohibited degrees. Then when the dispensation arrived, Elizabeth was pregnant. In mid-September 1486, she gave birth to a healthy boy and heir, and England breathed again. They named him Arthur, a choice heavy with legend, meant to suggest not just continuity but destiny, a new Camelot rising from old wounds. Still, her coronation did not follow immediately. Henry faced rebellion in 1487, the first major threat to his reign. Only after that storm was controlled did Elizabeth finally receive her crown in that extraordinary ceremony at Westminster. It was lavish, and importantly, it was well attended. We have one of the rare detailed accounts of 15th century English coronations for it. The only comparable surviving account is for Richard III's coronation 4 years earlier. The contrast is striking. Elizabeth's event appears more harmonious, more widely embraced. An estimated 185 knights were present, nearly double the number at Richard's coronation. Attendance at an event like this wasn't just about celebration. It was a public measuring of loyalty, a demonstration that the political community of England was willing, at least outwardly, to gather under one roof and pretend the war was finished. The propaganda of the early Tudor period didn't stop at ceremonies either. Even the private spaces of the monarchy were designed to speak. Henry and Elizabeth's marital bed, astonishingly preserved and later rediscovered, became one of the most intimate artifacts of political messaging imaginable. Carved from oak, it was a 4-poster bed crowned with lions and roses, red and white united. It bore religious and dynastic imagery, the cross, the tree of life, and a triptych-like headboard showing Henry and Elizabeth in a deliberate allusion to Adam and Eve flanked by coats of arms. Even there, even in the supposed privacy of marriage, the message was hammered into wood: this union brings new life, new order, a future. But not everyone believed it. On May 24, 1487, Yorkist conspirators in Dublin crowned a boy named Lambert Simnel, claiming he was Edward, Earl of Warwick, though the real Warwick was in Henry's custody. Simnel was a puppet, a convenient face for men like John de la Pole, Earl of Lincoln, whom Richard III had once designated as his successor. The rebellion ended at the Battle of Stoke on June 16, 1487. Henry won. Simnel was spared, reduced from king to household servant, proof that the true danger was never the boy but the nobles who tried to use him. And the threats didn't stop. In 1490, Perkin Warbeck emerged, claiming to be Richard of Shrewsbury, Elizabeth's younger brother, one of the vanished princes. Warbeck was far more dangerous than Simnel. He attracted support across Europe and haunted Henry's reign through the 1490s. There is no solid reason to believe Elizabeth accepted him as her brother, but his very claim reopened wounds England could never fully close. Warbeck was finally captured and executed in November 1499 after attempting to escape, and the message was clear. This time the threat would be cut out completely. People often paint Elizabeth as a passive figure, a woman swept along by events, a pawn moved across a board until she was married and quietly disappeared into motherhood. But that picture doesn't hold. Yes, her childhood and adolescence were dominated by other people's strategies. She was betrothed to George Neville and then to the French Dauphin before she was 10. Later, rumors and plans continued to circle her as men tried to solve England's dynastic puzzle. But once she became queen, she mattered in a different way. She became Henry's bridge to the Yorkists, his living proof that the union was real, his way of calming the faction that might otherwise never accept him. There has long been a popular idea that Elizabeth was overshadowed by her mother-in-law, Margaret Beaufort, and that the two women were bitter rivals. A Spanish diplomat even reported that Elizabeth was kept in subjection by the king's mother. But court gossip often sounds sharper than truth. Margaret Beaufort did hold unusual influence. Yes, she had spent years fighting to put her son on the throne. But influence is not the same as dominance, and rivalry is not the only way two powerful women can exist in the same space. The evidence suggests cooperation far more than warfare. Elizabeth understood what Margaret represented, and Margaret understood what Elizabeth represented. Their power was different, but it could point in the same direction, stabilizing the new dynasty. Elizabeth also took her own role seriously, especially regarding her sisters and the remnants of her family. Her mother, Elizabeth Woodville, was pushed away from court and spent her final years in relative obscurity before dying in 1492. That meant Elizabeth of York became, in many ways, the central figure for what remained of the Yorkist women at court. Her household accounts reveal a queen with her own resources and preferences, purchasing fine fabrics from merchants in Bruges and Antwerp, managing spending with the confidence of someone used to wealth as a tool. She had access not only because she was queen, but because lands tied to the Duchy of York were assigned to her after the political settlements of 1485, reinforcing her importance as Edward IV's eldest surviving child. After Cecily Neville died in 1495, Elizabeth inherited further lands including estates at Weymouth, Portland, and Wareham. She also acted as a patron. Payments to composers like William Cornish and Robert Fairfax suggest a court alive with performance, especially during the Christmas revels that stretched across the festive season. And she wasn't merely consuming culture, she was shaping it. In 1502, Robert Virtue, the master mason working on Greenwich Palace, was building from a plan said to have been produced by Elizabeth herself. Even her leisure interests appear in the accounts. Greyhounds, hawks, the marks of a royal household that expected sport and ceremony as part of life. Elizabeth also stood at the edge of a new revolution, printing. The spread of movable type transformed Europe's relationship with words, knowledge, and religion. In England, William Caxton became the pioneer, bringing printing home after encountering the technology in the Low Countries and the Rhineland. He published early English books, including Chaucer, Aesop, and romances that fed a growing hunger for printed stories and prayers. One of the last works associated with him, around 1490, was patronized jointly by Elizabeth and Margaret Beaufort, a prayer book known as the 15 O's and Other Prayers, its title page openly acknowledging the Queen and the King's mother as patrons. It's a small detail, but it's revealing. Elizabeth was not invisible. She was present where influence quietly mattered: religion, culture, the shaping of public devotion. Portraits of Elizabeth survive, though whether any were painted from life remains uncertain. One early example at Hampton Court, known from inventories by 1542, shows her in rich clothing holding the White Rose of York, her image already being curated in the reign of her son Henry VIII. Another version later sits in the National Portrait Gallery. Most later depictions trace back to those early models, suggesting that even after her death, England continued to need a visual Elizabeth, not merely a queen but the embodied union itself. By the mid-1490s, the focus shifted from producing heirs to marrying them. The most urgent question was Prince Arthur's future wife. The choice fell on Spain, where Isabella of Castile and Ferdinand of Aragon were reshaping Europe. Their marriage had begun the unification of Spain. They conquered Granada in 1492, ending Muslim rule there, and that same year Columbus crossed the Atlantic, opening a new world to European imagination. For England, an alliance with Spain offered strength against France. Arthur was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon in 1497 and married her in November 1501. They went to Ludlow Castle to establish a household for the Prince of Wales. It was symbolic, traditional, and it should have been the beginning of stability. Instead, tragedy struck. On April 2, 1502, Arthur died at Ludlow, possibly of influenza, plague, or the dreaded sweating sickness. Even now, historians debate the exact cause, but the emotional impact is not disputed. News reached Greenwich Palace and Henry VIII was crushed. Later writers described Elizabeth consoling him, reminding him they still had other children, still had a future. But when she returned to her own chambers, her grief overwhelmed her so deeply that those around her sent for Henry to comfort her. That image, queen and king, each trying to hold the other up while both are breaking, cuts through the political narrative and reveals the human one. Catherine of Aragon remained in England, and negotiations began to marry her to the new heir, Prince Henry. At the same time, plans moved for Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Margaret. Henry VIII wanted peace with Scotland and sought to marry Margaret to James IV. Those negotiations dragged on, as they often did, because Margaret couldn't marry until she approached her teenage years. The Treaty of Perpetual Peace in 1502 secured the match despite objections from those who feared a Scottish claim to England's throne if the Tudor line failed. A proxy marriage took place, followed by Margaret's formal marriage at Holyrood Abbey in August 1503. But all of that was beginning to unfurl just as Elizabeth's own story approached its most fragile turn. After Arthur's death, Elizabeth became pregnant again at 36. Early in 1503, she went into confinement at the Tower of London. Complications emerged. The royal surgeon, Master Robert, was summoned on January 22 as a precaution. On February 2, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl. She and Henry named her Catherine. The infant died just over a week later. And then Elizabeth herself developed a postpartum infection, the kind that in an age before antibiotics so often turned childbirth into a death sentence. Elizabeth died on February 11, 1503, her 37th birthday. It happened quickly, too quickly for preparation, too quickly for precedent. She was the first Tudor queen to die, and the dynasty was still young enough to feel vulnerable. London went into mourning almost immediately. Henry was devastated. He ordered 636 masses to be said for her soul, an astonishing number, a flood of prayers meant to reach her wherever he believed she had gone. After lying in state in the Tower Chapel, her body was conveyed through London drawn by 6 horses, and on February 23 she was buried at Westminster Abbey. The grief of the city suggests she had been genuinely loved, not merely respected. After her death, Henry VIII changed. He became more withdrawn, more guarded, ruling through a smaller circle of ministers. Over time, his methods made him unpopular: his taxes, his financial controls, the cold efficiency of men around him. When he died in 1509 and his son became Henry VIII, many in England were simply relieved to see a young king again. Elizabeth's legacy, though, didn't end with her burial. It rippled outward through every child she bore, through every marriage arranged, through every claim stitched together by her blood. Her grandchildren would sit on England's throne. Her descendants would shape Scotland's fate as well. She became, in a very real sense, a mother of dynasties, one of the central roots from which the Tudor era grew. And when you look back at her life, it's hard not to feel the contradiction at the heart of it. Elizabeth of York was born into a world that treated royal daughters as bargaining chips, moved them from betrothal to betrothal, used their futures as currency. Yet she also became something more than that. She became the face of reconciliation, the bridge between factions that had been killing each other for decades, the quiet center of a court trying to become stable again. And still, the question lingers because it's impossible to ignore. In a life defined by other people's moves, how much did Elizabeth herself shape the board, and how much did she simply endure as the pieces shifted around her again and again, pulling her forward into whatever came next? And whatever came next, it never arrived gently. Because even after the crown settled onto her head in 1487, even after England applauded the image of red and white roses finally braided into one, the past didn't simply vanish. It waited. It watched. It looked for weak seams in this new Tudor stitching, and it tugged at them whenever it could. Elizabeth understood that in a way few people around her fully did. Not because she was trained as a strategist, not because she held councils or commanded armies, but because the chaos had lived inside her childhood. She had felt stability collapse before. She had watched a throne turn into a trap. She had seen how quickly a family name could become a sentence. So as queen, her role was not only ceremonial, not only maternal. It was symbolic in the most dangerous sense. She had to be visible, admired, calm. She had to be believable. And perhaps that's why her coronation mattered so much. Henry VIII needed more than a wife. He needed a living seal, a public proof that the House of York was not merely subdued but joined. That the old royal bloodline didn't sit in exile somewhere, sharpening knives in the dark. It stood beside him in Westminster Abbey, dressed in cloth of gold, crowned beneath the same roof where monarchs had been sanctified for centuries. But a crown doesn't erase suspicion. It only gives people something new to question. Because for many Yorkists who had survived the wars, the Tudor victory at Bosworth still felt like an interruption, not an ending. Henry had defeated Richard III, yes. Richard had been hated, yes. But Henry himself was still an outsider to a certain kind of English nobility, Welsh blood on his father's side, Beaufort complications on his mother's, and a claim that could sound fragile if you spoke it too loudly in the wrong room. Elizabeth's presence strengthened him, but it also created a paradox. The more legitimacy she gave him, the more dangerous she became. If she remained beloved, if people saw her as the rightful Yorkist heir, then her opinions mattered. Her moods mattered. Her loyalty mattered. And if ever there were doubts about Henry's right to rule, people could whisper the obvious question behind closed doors. If Elizabeth is York, why is Henry king? That is the tightrope she walked. And in those early years, she walked it while doing what queens were expected to do above all else, bearing children, and doing it under a public gaze so intense it must have felt suffocating. Arthur's birth in September 1486 was more than joy. It was relief. It was the sound of England exhaling after decades of uncertainty. A male heir meant the Tudor line could root itself into the future with something stronger than claims and ceremonies. It meant this new dynasty could become ordinary with time, the way all dynasties try to. But even that relief came with pressure, because the country didn't just want an heir. It wanted a guarantee. It wanted spare heirs. It wanted proof that the royal womb could keep producing stability like a steady river. Elizabeth delivered 7 pregnancies in total, 7 children. A constant rhythm of confinement, recovery, and the quiet dread that came with every birth in a world where even queens died in childbed. That reality never softened. It sat in the background of her life like a shadow she could not outrun. And yet, despite the danger, the household accounts and scattered references suggest a woman who did not vanish into fear. She maintained a courtly presence. She surrounded herself with the textures of queenship: fine cloth, imported fabric, household pages, ceremonial gifts. These aren't trivial details. In her world, spending was a language. Patronage was a statement. Even the choice of what a queen wore, what she gifted, what she commissioned, these were ways of moving power without ever standing at a council table. Elizabeth's court was not simply decoration, it was a network. Her household accounts show her making payments, commissioning clothing, ordering textiles from Bruges and Antwerp, the kinds of luxuries that broadcast status across Europe. When she spent, she wasn't merely indulging. She was signaling that the Yorkist queen stood firmly within the Tudor structure, not as a prisoner, not as a token, but as the Queen of England in full dignity. And within that dignity was influence. It's easy to imagine Elizabeth as silent because we don't have her letters spilling emotion and opinion across parchment. But the lack of surviving words doesn't mean the absence of voice. It means her voice traveled through other routes, through marriages arranged, through households managed, through favors granted and withheld. Her sisters, for instance, were not an afterthought to her. They were living pieces of Yorkist blood, and how they were treated mattered. Poor marriages would be read as humiliation. Rich alliances would be read as reconciliation. Elizabeth understood that, and whatever influence she had, she used it to ensure her sisters were provided for in a way that reinforced the idea that York was not being punished, but absorbed. Because if York felt punished, York would rebel, and rebellion was never far. Lambert Simnel's rising in 1487 had already shown how quickly people could rally behind a boy with the right name, even when the boy wasn't that person at all. Henry had crushed that rebellion at Stoke and then done something clever. He spared Simnel and kept him in the royal household. It was a calculated mercy. A way of telling the realm, look, I can be generous because I am secure. Even mercy became propaganda, but Perkin Warbeck was different. Warbeck didn't claim to be some distant cousin. He claimed to be Richard of Shrewsbury, the younger of the two princes who had vanished in the Tower, the brother Elizabeth had lost. That claim was poison. Because it forced a conversation England didn't want to have publicly. What happened to the princes? Who killed them? Were they truly dead? Warbeck's handlers understood the psychological power of that question. They understood that England, exhausted by years of war, could still be tempted by the fantasy of a lost prince returning. A rightful heir, a miracle that undid the horror. And imagine what that must have done to Elizabeth. Not the political impact, but the human one. Because even if she knew he was an imposter, even if she recognized he could not be her brother, the claim itself dragged her back into the most traumatic mystery of her life. It made her live again inside that moment when her brothers were taken away, shut behind stone walls and never returned. A queen can't publicly mourn in the way ordinary people do. Her grief must be measured. Her face must remain composed. Her words must serve the crown. But grief doesn't disappear because it's inconvenient. It just learns to hide. So while Henry battled Warbeck's supporters across the 1490s, while foreign courts flirted with the pretender for their own advantage, Elizabeth lived in a constant state of symbolic warfare. Her family's wounds were being used as a weapon against her husband, and her husband's legitimacy was being threatened through her blood. It is difficult to imagine a more intimate form of political stress. And yet, through it all, the evidence suggests something else was growing between Henry and Elizabeth, something that began as strategy but matured into attachment. Because their marriage was arranged under pressure, yes, but records, behavior, and later testimony imply genuine closeness. Henry took counsel from Elizabeth. He relied on her as a stabilizing force, and whether she intended it or not, she became a humanizing presence at a court that could otherwise have turned cold and suspicious. This matters because Henry VII was not a romantic king by reputation. He was careful, he was watchful. He was the kind of ruler who counted costs, weighed risks, trusted slowly. A man like that does not yield influence easily. So if Elizabeth's advice mattered to him, if her presence soothed him, then her role was more than ornamental. And still, the old story persists. The one that says Margaret Beaufort controlled everything, that Elizabeth was kept in the background, that the Queen lived in quiet submission while her formidable mother-in-law ruled the court like a second monarch. The truth is more complicated. Margaret Beaufort was unquestionably powerful. She was the mother of the king, and she had fought for his claim like a woman possessed by purpose. She had survived danger, plotted carefully, endured years of uncertainty with a kind of iron patience. When Henry became king, she did not step aside. She stepped forward, but forward does not always mean against. It is possible, likely even, that Elizabeth and Margaret had a relationship built on pragmatism. They needed each other. Margaret's authority strengthened Henry's reign. Elizabeth's legitimacy softened it. One was the engine, the other the seal. One carried the king's past, the other carried England's future. And in moments they even appeared united, like in their shared patronage of Caxton's prayer book, a public display of piety and dynastic unity. That kind of joint gesture wasn't accidental. It told the court that the Queen and the king's mother were not at war. It told them the women at the heart of this dynasty were aligned. But alignment does not mean equality. Elizabeth still had to live beside a woman who had been the architect of Henry's rise. A woman who had her own household, her own servants, her own influence, her own daily presence at court. Margaret's shadow was real even if it wasn't hostile. And Elizabeth had to shape her own identity as queen without appearing to challenge the king's mother. So she did it the way queens often did, through presence, through motherhood, through quiet patronage, through making herself indispensable. She was seen, she was revered. She was the mother of the heir, and she was York. As the years passed and the 1490s turned into a new century, Elizabeth's life took on a strange duality. On one hand, it was full children, court ceremonies, Christmas revels, diplomatic receptions, the rhythmic motion of royal life. On the other hand, it was precarious, because every pregnancy carried danger and every political tremor reminded her that stability could shatter quickly. Her children became the new focal point of Europe's attention. Arthur, the living symbol of Tudor destiny; Margaret, a princess whose marriage could reshape the border with Scotland; Henry, the spare heir, growing into a boy with his own ambitions and charm. The daughters Elizabeth, Mary, each holding potential alliances within their futures. Each child was both beloved and burdened, and with every year the stakes grew higher. Because the longer the Tudor dynasty survived, the more desperate its enemies became to prove it didn't deserve to. And that desperation, simmering across Europe, was always looking for the easiest pressure point. And the easiest pressure point was the queen whose blood could legitimize a king or destroy him. So while England celebrated the image of peace, while the Tudor rose became a proud emblem stamped onto banners and carved into furniture and embroidered into clothing, beneath that image there was still a question that never fully went away. What happens if Elizabeth's loyalty is questioned? What happens if her children die? What happens if the Yorkist claim rises again, wearing her face, her name, her memory? Those questions didn't need to be spoken aloud to shape the air around her. And then, in the early years of the new century, one of those fears became real in the most devastating way possible, when the future that had been pinned so carefully to Prince Arthur began to unravel, and the royal household at Greenwich felt a sudden chill in its corridors, the kind that makes even servants whisper, the kind that makes courtiers glance at each other with dread, because it meant the dynasty's brightest promise had just stepped into uncertainty again. Because when a kingdom has trained itself to lean on one child, it doesn't just lose a son when that child dies. It loses the shape of the future it had been rehearsing in its mind. Arthur had been raised like an answer. Not merely the firstborn, not merely the heir, but a carefully named symbol, a prince whose very existence was meant to quiet doubts. The name Arthur was never casual. It carried legend, unity, the romance of an older Britain that people wanted to believe in. And for years, England had watched him grow with that hunger in their eyes, the hunger of a nation that wanted the nightmare of civil war to stay behind it forever. So when Arthur married Catherine of Aragon in November 1501, it felt like the world locking into place. Catherine brought Spain's power, Spain's wealth, Spain's rising influence across Europe. Isabella and Ferdinand were shaping the continent in real time, finishing the conquest of Granada, projecting their reach beyond the sea, while France remained a constant rival to be watched, contained, and outmaneuvered. England under Henry VII had done something it rarely managed during the chaos of the previous decades. It had chosen a stable direction and committed to it. Arthur and Catherine were not just a couple, they were policy made flesh. They were sent to Ludlow Castle, near the Welsh border as heirs traditionally were, to learn the gravity of rule away from the softness of court. It was meant to be a beginning, a settling, a quiet step into adulthood. Instead, the household at Ludlow became heavy with sickness. No one can tell you with certainty what illness took Arthur. That uncertainty is part of what makes it so haunting. Some accounts hint at influenza, others point toward plague. Others still whisper about the sweating sickness, that terrifying, mysterious illness that seemed to strike like lightning and kill with brutal speed. Whatever it was, it moved fast enough and it hit hard enough that by April 2, 1502, the heir to England was dead. Imagine the messenger riding toward Greenwich with that news. Imagine the atmosphere changing before the words were even spoken, as if the palace itself sensed what was coming. Greenwich had been a place of celebration, of confidence, of forward motion. But bad news has a way of making even the richest halls feel narrow. When word reached Henry VII, the king broke. Not in the theatrical way people sometimes imagine kings breaking, but in the quiet, private devastation of a man who knows what he has just lost. Not only his son, but the architecture of his reign. Arthur had been the proof that the Tudor experiment could outlast its founder. Now that proof was gone. And Elizabeth, who had already lost so much in her life that grief must have felt like a familiar room, had to endure another kind of loss. Not the loss of a brother to political murder, not the loss of a father to sudden death that triggered a chain of catastrophe. This was the loss of her own child, the boy she had carried, the boy she had watched become the centerpiece of a nation's hope. Later writers describe a moment that feels painfully human. Elizabeth comforting Henry, reminding him that they still had other children. that the dynasty did not die with Arthur, that there was still a future. It's the kind of consolation that sounds logical when spoken aloud, and yet it doesn't touch the ache in the chest. Because after she had spoken those steadier words to her husband, Elizabeth returned to her own chambers, and the weight of what had happened fell on her fully. The accounts say her motherly remembrance struck her so deeply that those around her felt compelled to send for the king to comfort her. That detail matters. It tells you they weren't cold monarchs performing grief for history. They were parents, two people trying to hold each other upright while the thing they had feared most, fragility, made itself real again. Arthur's death also triggered an immediate political panic that would not have been visible to the servants quietly lighting candles or the ladies folding linens. Because the moment Arthur died, Catherine of Aragon became both a question and a danger. Catherine was still young. She had crossed seas, entered an unfamiliar court, married into an unfamiliar dynasty, and suddenly found herself a widow in a foreign land. Her value as an alliance did not vanish with Arthur. If anything, it intensified. Spain was still powerful. The marriage agreement still mattered. And England, suddenly aware again of how quickly heirs could disappear, could not afford to lose Catherine as an ally. So the court turned its eyes toward the spare heir, Prince Henry. The second son is always a strange position in monarchy. Raised with privilege but not burdened with the full weight of expectation, the spare is supposed to be insurance, important but not central. Yet when the heir dies, the spare becomes the future in an instant. That transition is never gentle. It is like being pushed onto a stage mid-performance while the audience stares, desperate for you to be convincing. Prince Henry was still young, but he was now everything. The continuity of the Tudor line, the stability of England, the proof that the crown would not be fought over again. And suddenly the marriage that had been planned for Arthur became a looming issue for Henry. Negotiations began, careful, tense, complicated negotiations to see if Catherine of Aragon could be remarried to the new heir. There were questions of legitimacy, of canon law, of whether Catherine's first marriage had been consummated, questions that would later swell into storms so huge they would reshape England itself. But at this moment, in the early months after Arthur's death, it was still only beginning, a diplomatic scramble to secure what had been lost. At the same time, the crown could not afford to rest its future on one boy alone. Henry VIII and Elizabeth had children, yes, but the brutal truth of the era was that children died. Even royal children died. Perhaps especially royal children, because their lives were lived under relentless pressure, under constant travel, under outbreaks of sickness that cared nothing for crowns. So the dynasty had to keep building. It had to keep linking itself outward through marriage, strengthening itself through alliances, spreading its roots wide enough that even tragedy could not topple it. That is why, even in grief, the planning continued. One of the most significant plans involved Elizabeth's eldest daughter, Margaret. Margaret was not simply a princess in waiting. She was one of Europe's most valuable marriage pieces, the daughter of a new dynasty that needed legitimacy and the granddaughter of an old dynasty that still carried weight. Henry VIII looked north, toward Scotland, and saw both danger and opportunity. Scotland had been England's neighbor, rival, and occasional nightmare for centuries. Peace between them was rare, and when it existed, it was fragile. Marrying Margaret to James IV of Scotland offered something new, a thread strong enough to bind two crowns in diplomacy rather than bloodshed. James IV had become king in 1488, still young, after his father James III died amid internal conflict. He was energetic, ambitious, clever, and he ruled in a way that made Scotland feel stronger than it had in years. The idea of uniting him to an English princess was powerful and terrifying to some English nobles, who worried that such a marriage would give the Scottish House of Stuart a claim to England's throne if the Tudor line ever faltered. That fear was not paranoia. It was logic. Dynasties lived and died on these connections, but Henry VIII valued stability more than noble anxiety. Negotiations stretched on, as they always did. Margaret had to reach an age considered appropriate for marriage under religious law, and treaties had to be shaped carefully, like metal being bent into a precise form. By 1502, the Treaty of Perpetual Peace secured the alliance despite objections. A proxy marriage followed, and plans were laid for the formal wedding in Scotland. While all of this unfolded, Elizabeth lived inside a constant contradiction. She was both deeply personal to these events and strangely removed from them. She was the mother watching her children become instruments of state. She was the queen whose role was to make those instruments appear warm, human, blessed. She was the woman whose grief over Arthur was real, but whose grief also had to be managed so it did not look like weakness, so it did not invite whispers that the dynasty was cursed, so it did not embolden enemies who were always listening for cracks. And enemies were still out there. Some had been silenced. Some had been executed, some had faded into irrelevance. But the memory of Yorkist resistance, the temptation of alternative claims, still lingered like smoke in the rafters of European courts. Even when Warbeck was finally captured and executed in 1499, even when the immediate threat was removed, the deeper truth remained. The Tudor crown had been born in violence, and violence always leaves behind unfinished stories. Elizabeth knew that better than anyone, because she had been the unfinished story once. The Yorkist princess whose brothers vanished. The young woman rumored to be the key to Richard III's plans. The bride Henry Tudor needed so the realm would accept him. Now she was queen, and yet the sense of being used by history never completely disappeared. It simply changed shape. In the records of her household, you still see her moving through life with intention, ordering fabric, paying musicians, supporting performances, keeping greyhounds and hawks, commissioning works. Maintaining the rhythms of a royal household that needed to project normalcy even when normalcy was always one sickness away from collapse. And then, after Arthur's death, something happened that must have felt like both duty and dread. Elizabeth became pregnant again. At 36, pregnancy was not extraordinary, but it carried risk. The body is not a machine that can be commanded forever, and medieval childbirth was a gamble every time, even for queens surrounded by physicians, midwives, and prayers. In fact, sometimes that closeness only sharpened the fear because everyone knew how often it ended badly. The court would have watched Elizabeth carefully. They would have watched her complexion, her energy, the way she walked. It would have whispered behind screens about whether she looked strong enough, whether she was eating enough, whether this pregnancy would secure the dynasty again or deepen its grief. And Elizabeth, who had lived her entire life under the gaze of people who needed her to be something, would have carried that child under pressure that went far beyond the physical. Because now the stakes were different. This pregnancy was not merely another child. It was an attempt to replace what had been lost, to provide another heir. To reassure the realm that Arthur's death had not broken the line, that the dynasty could regenerate, and it meant confinement again. Isolation, ritual, the queen withdrawing into carefully controlled rooms where the air was heavy with incense and expectation, where the women around her moved in hushed tones, where even time seemed to slow because everyone was waiting for one thing, the moment of birth. Elizabeth went into confinement at the Tower of London, a place that carried its own strange symbolism. For her, the Tower was not simply a royal residence. It was the place where her brothers had been held, the place where they vanished, the place that held the deepest unanswered question of her life. To return there, even as queen, even with attendants, must have stirred something in her, some cold memory that never fully thawed. By late January 1503, there were enough concerns that the royal surgeon was summoned as a precaution. Precaution, a polite word for fear. And then on February 2nd, Elizabeth gave birth to a baby girl. They named her Catherine. For a brief moment, there would have been relief because the queen had survived the delivery, because a child had been born, because the dynasty had one more branch, but the relief did not last. The baby died within days, just over a week later, and in a court already raw from Arthur's death, that loss was like a second blow to the same bruise. Worse still, Elizabeth herself grew ill afterward. A postpartum infection, the kind that was tragically common and often fatal in that era. Fever, weakness, the body turning against itself after the trauma of childbirth. Modern medicine would later treat it like a problem to be solved. But in 1503, it was more often a death sentence written slowly. And the palace would have shifted again into that dreadful stillness where servants walk more quietly, where doors close softly, where people glance at one another with fear but avoid saying it aloud. Because if Elizabeth died, something immense would be lost. Not just a queen, not just a beloved figure. The entire symbolic foundation of Tudor legitimacy would crack. The Yorkist bloodline would be gone from the king's side. The human bridge between factions would vanish. And as Elizabeth's illness deepened, Henry VIII, careful Henry, guarded Henry, would have been confronted with a terror he couldn't tax away, couldn't negotiate away, couldn't imprison away. The terror of losing the person who made his reign feel acceptable to half the realm. And outside those walls, England would have held its breath again because it had seen this pattern too many times. A king dies unexpectedly. A child succeeds. A regent steps in. A claim is challenged. War begins. No one wanted to say it, but everyone could feel it. The death of one woman could make the future unstable all over again. And in those last days, as the court waited for signs of recovery, as prayers were spoken over and over with desperate insistence, as candles burned down into wax pools like time itself melting away, the question hovering behind every whispered conversation was the same question that had haunted Elizabeth's entire life in one form or another. If she goes, what comes next? And who will seize that opening first? And in that waiting, that suspended moment where no one dared to speak certainty into the air, Elizabeth of York slipped toward the edge of the story she had spent her entire life holding together. Her illness did not announce itself with drama. It crept, fever that would not break, weakness that deepened instead of lifting. The kind of sickness that turns hope into bargaining. One more night, one more prayer, one more sign that the body is turning back toward life instead of away from it. In the early 16th century, even the most skilled physicians could do little more than observe, recommend rest, bleed when they thought it might help, and pray that nature chose mercy. Nature did not. Elizabeth died on February 11, 1503, her 37th birthday. The date itself feels cruel, as though time wanted to underline the loss. She had survived usurpation, civil war, exile within her own country, the murder of her brothers, the collapse of one dynasty, and the uncertain birth of another. She had fulfilled every expectation placed upon her daughter, bride, queen, mother, symbol. And still her life ended the same way so many women's lives did in that era, in a bed where giving life took her own. What followed was shock because there had been no preparation for this moment. Elizabeth was young by the standards of the time, still firmly within what was considered her childbearing years. There had been no expectation that the queen would die before the king. No plans carefully folded away for her funeral, no rehearsed rituals refined by precedent. She was the first Tudor queen to die, and England had no script for it. London went into mourning almost immediately. The speed of that reaction matters. It tells you something about how Elizabeth had been perceived, not merely as a queen who existed in the background, not merely as a vessel for heirs, but as a presence people felt. When news spread, the city responded with a sincerity that cannot be forced. Bells tolled, black cloth appeared, the rhythms of daily life slowed in acknowledgement of something lost. Henry VIII was devastated. This was not the calculated sorrow of a ruler managing appearances. Contemporary accounts emphasize how deeply he was affected, how abruptly his world narrowed. He ordered 636 masses to be said for Elizabeth's soul, an extraordinary number, almost obsessive in its scale. It was a king's attempt to do something, anything, in a moment where power meant nothing. You can hear the desperation in that order. If prayer could reach her, then let prayer flood heaven. Elizabeth's body lay for 10 days in the chapel at the Tower of London, the place where she had given birth, the place where she had died, the place that had once held her brothers and swallowed them into silence. Afterward, her body was conveyed through London to Westminster Abbey, drawn by 6 horses, passing through streets lined with people who watched in stillness. That procession was not only a farewell, it was a reminder. This was the woman who had ended a war without ever lifting a sword. She was buried on February 23rd. Henry never fully recovered from her death. Something in him folded inward and stayed there. He withdrew. He trusted fewer people. He ruled more through calculation than confidence. Over time, his ministers, men like Edmund Dudley, became symbols of an increasingly unpopular regime, associated with heavy taxation and cold administration. The warmth that Elizabeth had brought to the image of the monarchy was gone, and nothing quite replaced it. When Henry VIII died in 1509 and his son ascended the throne as Henry VIII, England greeted the change with relief. A young king, a fresh face, a sense once again of renewal. Few paused to think about how much of that optimism traced back not just to Henry VIII himself, but to the woman who had made his existence possible in the first place. Elizabeth's tomb at Westminster Abbey, later commissioned by her son and crafted by the Italian sculptor Pietro Torrigiano, placed her beside her husband in bronze and marble. Angels' effigies, permanence. It was a statement meant to freeze something that history never allows to stay still. Even in death, she was presented as part of a pair, part of a union, part of a dynasty. But dynasties do not remember evenly. As the years passed, England's story grew louder, more chaotic, more dramatic. Henry VII's reign swallowed the narrative whole. His wars, his marriages, his break with Rome, his volatile temperament. 6 wives in a decade, executions, religious upheaval. A kingdom reshaped in ways Elizabeth of York could never have imagined. Yet every one of those events flowed from her. Henry VII was her son. Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I were her grandchildren. The entire Tudor century unfolded along lines her marriage had drawn. Even beyond England, her blood continued to move through Europe. Through her daughter Margaret's marriage to James IV of Scotland, Elizabeth became the ancestor of the Stuart kings. Her great-grandson James VI of Scotland would eventually become James I of England in 1603, uniting the crowns a century after Elizabeth herself had helped unite the claims. And still, despite that reach, despite that legacy, Elizabeth of York often slips into the margins of popular history. Perhaps because she did not rule alone. Perhaps because she did not rebel or conquer or legislate. Perhaps because her power was quieter, and quiet power is easy to underestimate. But quiet does not mean weak. It means restrained. It means operating in spaces that do not leave dramatic speeches behind for historians to quote. Elizabeth's life forces an uncomfortable question onto anyone who studies it closely. How do we measure agency in a world that denied women formal authority? Was she merely a pawn, passed from betrothal to betrothal, used by men to stabilize their claims and end their wars? Or was she something more subtle and more difficult to categorize? A conscious actor who understood the limits placed on her and worked within them to protect her family, to soften a brutal transition, to give a fractured country a face it could accept. Because even if she did not choose the role she was given, she chose how to inhabit it. She chose to stand beside Henry, not behind him. She chose to embrace her identity as York instead of erasing it. She chose to act as a bridge rather than a grievance. And in doing so, she made it possible for a new dynasty to survive long enough to become ordinary. Elizabeth of York did not end the Wars of the Roses with a battle. She ended them by existing, by marrying the right man at the right moment, by bearing children who made future wars unnecessary, by embodying reconciliation in a world addicted to division. And yet, even that feels incomplete. Because if history teaches anything through her story, it is that peace achieved through individuals is always fragile. It lasts only as long as memory holds. Once people forget why the Union mattered, once they stop fearing the chaos that came before, the old impulses return in new forms. Elizabeth's life closed one chapter of England's violence, but it opened another, one filled with ambition, reform, excess, and transformation. And at the center of that turning point, often unacknowledged, stands a woman who never ruled alone, never commanded armies, never issued proclamations in her own name, and yet without whom the entire Tudor story simply does not exist. And that leaves the question lingering, unresolved, just as it has for centuries, whether Elizabeth of York was shaped by history more than she shaped it, or whether her greatest influence lay precisely in the fact that she changed the course of events without ever needing to announce that she was doing so. Because once you start looking at Elizabeth of York that way, the story refuses to stay finished. It stretches forward, backward, sideways, threading itself through moments that seem at first glance to belong to other people entirely. Her influence doesn't end where her life does. It lingers in choices made by those who survived her, in silences where her voice might once have been heard, in the subtle shifts that happened at court after she was gone. After her death, something essential went missing from Henry VII's reign. The king remained competent, cautious, meticulous, but the balance was altered. Elizabeth had been the human answer to doubt. Without her, the crown felt heavier, more exposed. Yorkist blood was no longer seated beside the king in flesh and breath. It existed only in memory, and memory is easier to challenge than reality. Henry's withdrawal was noticed. Courtiers saw it. Foreign ambassadors sensed it. He relied increasingly on a small circle of advisors, men who were effective but unloved. The warmth that Elizabeth had projected through ceremony, charity, visibility could not be replicated by ministers with account books and warrants. The court became more efficient and less forgiving. The realm grew quieter but also more resentful. And this too traces back to her absence, because Elizabeth had not ruled by command, she ruled by presence, by making things feel settled even when they were, by embodying continuity in a kingdom that had lost faith in it. Her children felt her absence in ways history only hints at. Prince Henry, the future Henry VIII, was just 12 when his mother died, old enough to remember her. Old enough to feel the shock of losing the person who had softened his father, who had provided emotional shelter in a court that was otherwise governed by discipline and expectation. It is impossible to draw a straight line from Elizabeth's death to the man Henry VIII became, but it is equally impossible to ignore that one of the last stabilizing forces in his early life vanished just as he was being reshaped into the future king. Margaret, already preparing for her marriage into Scotland, carried her mother's legacy across the border. When she left England for Holyrood Abbey in 1503, she carried not just Tudor blood but Yorkist memory. Her life in Scotland would be complicated, often dangerous, marked by political upheaval and personal loss. Yet through her, Elizabeth's bloodline continued to work quietly, reshaping the future of both kingdoms from the inside. Even Mary, Elizabeth's younger daughter, would later become a Queen of France, briefly linking England to yet another European throne. The pattern repeats. Elizabeth's children as bridges, as solutions, as living treaties. And always, beneath it all, is the shadow of what Elizabeth herself had lived through, the knowledge that nothing is permanent, that crowns slip, that promises unravel, that legitimacy can be argued away if the right voice speaks loudly enough. That knowledge may explain why Elizabeth never attempted to dominate the political stage in obvious ways. She had seen what overt ambition did to families. She had seen how quickly a powerful man could be reframed as a traitor, how a protector could become a usurper, how a beloved brother could vanish behind a locked door and never come back. So she chose another path. She chose steadiness. She chose to let her identity speak louder than her demands, and that choice paradoxically made her indispensable. When Henry VII married her, he gained more than a wife. He gained silence from those who might otherwise have screamed rebellion. He gained the reluctant acceptance of men who did not love him but could tolerate him because Elizabeth stood at his side. He gained children whose blood closed arguments before they could fully form. That is power, even if it doesn't look like it. And yet, history often prefers its power loud. It prefers kings who conquer, queens who decree, figures who leave behind manifestos and laws and dramatic confrontations. Elizabeth left behind something harder to catalog, a sense of legitimacy that only existed because she lived long enough to embody it and died before it could be tested again. If she had lived longer, if she had reached the 80 years an astrologer once absurdly predicted, what might have changed? Would Henry VII have ruled differently with her beside him into old age? Would Henry VII have been tempered by her presence as he grew into adulthood? Would the break with Rome have unfolded the same way if the living symbol of dynastic reconciliation still walked the halls of court? Those questions have no answers, but the fact that they feel worth asking tells you something important. Elizabeth of York mattered. She mattered not because she seized power, but because she absorbed it, not because she shouted, but because she steadied, not because she demanded loyalty, but because her existence made loyalty feel reasonable. And that is why her story resists a clean ending. Because even now, when we trace the Tudor century, its triumphs, its disasters, its excesses, its transformation, we keep circling back to the same quiet hinge moment. A young woman raised as a political prize, surviving catastrophe after catastrophe, stepping into a marriage that was meant to end a war and succeeding in that task simply by being exactly who she was. The daughter of Edward IV, the sister of vanished princes. The wife of Henry VII, the mother of kings and queens, the living union of York and Lancaster. And as long as England remembers the Tudors, as long as their story is told as a turning point between medieval chaos and early modern power, Elizabeth of York remains there, standing just behind the noise, holding together a moment that could easily have shattered again, reminding us that sometimes the most decisive figures in history are the ones who never seem to be making decisions at all, only enduring, adapting, and quietly shaping the path forward while the world around them argues over who deserves the crown next, because that argument over who deserves the crown never truly disappears. It just changes its language. In Elizabeth of York's lifetime, legitimacy was argued with swords, marriages, and bloodlines traced through generations of kings. After her death, the arguments became more refined, more legalistic, more theological, but they were still arguments about the same thing: who belongs at the center of power and why others should accept it. Elizabeth had been the answer to that question for nearly 2 decades. Without her, the Tudor crown had to rely on memory, precedent, and the growing authority of Henry VII's rule. That worked mostly, but the tension never vanished entirely. It simmered beneath the surface, visible in the anxiety surrounding Prince Henry, in the careful management of noble families, in the persistent fear that some forgotten branch of royal blood might one day rise again and demand recognition. What Elizabeth had done, simply by living and marrying and bearing children, was give England time. Time to tire of civil war. Time to allow a new dynasty to harden into something familiar. Time for the idea of Tudor to stop sounding temporary. And time is often the most powerful political weapon of all. That is why, even though Elizabeth rarely appears at the center of dramatic episodes, she remains essential to understanding how England survived one of the most unstable periods in its history. Her life forms a bridge between 2 eras that otherwise feel violently disconnected. On one side, a medieval world where kings were made and unmade by force. On the other, an early modern world where monarchy became increasingly institutional, bureaucratic, and ideological. Elizabeth stands at the crossing. She was born into war, raised in uncertainty, married to end conflict, and died before the full shape of the new world revealed itself. She never saw the Reformation tear England away from Rome. She never saw her son dissolve monasteries or marry and discard queens with terrifying speed. She never saw the nation transform itself under the weight of religious upheaval and centralized power. But those transformations all rested on a foundation she helped lay. Because Henry VII could only rule as boldly as he did because his father's dynasty survived its infancy. And that survival depended on Elizabeth, on her blood, on her children, on her ability to make an unnatural union look natural enough that people stopped resisting it. In that sense, Elizabeth's greatest achievement was not peace itself, but the illusion of inevitability. She made the Tudor dynasty feel like the logical continuation of English history rather than a violent interruption. Once that illusion took hold, resistance became nostalgia instead of rebellion. And yet, for all that influence, Elizabeth herself never escaped the limits of her time. She could not choose her husband freely. She could not protect her brothers. She could not refuse the pregnancies that slowly wore down her body. She could not step away from the role history demanded of her without risking everything she had worked, consciously or unconsciously, to stabilize. Her power was conditional, fragile, dependent on her health, her fertility, her perceived obedience. That contradiction sits at the heart of her story. She was essential yet expendable, revered yet replaceable in treaties. Central to legitimacy, yet excluded from decision-making in its most overt forms. And still she endured. She endured the death of a father whose reign she had been born into believing was secure. She endured the disappearance of brothers who should have ruled. She endured sanctuary, rumors, manipulation, and marriage under pressure. She endured childbirth after childbirth in a world where each one could kill her. She endured being remembered primarily as a symbol rather than as a person. And endurance in a violent age is not passive. It is survival with consequences. Elizabeth of York did not leave behind manifestos or laws or military victories. She left behind something quieter and harder to erase. A lineage that outlived its enemies, a settlement that held long enough to become tradition, and a reminder that history is not shaped only by those who seize power, but also by those who make power acceptable. Her life invites us to reconsider how we tell stories about influence. It asks whether we measure importance by volume, by visibility, by conflict, or whether we are willing to recognize the force of stability in a world addicted to upheaval. Because without Elizabeth, the Tudor story collapses into improbability. Without her, Henry VIII remains a conqueror with a fragile claim. Without her, Henry VIII is a king without the bloodline that made his authority unquestionable. Without her, the eventual union of England and Scotland through her descendants never materializes in the same way. And yet with her, all of it becomes possible. That is the paradox of Elizabeth of York. She shaped the future by making herself indispensable and then vanishing before anyone fully noticed how much they relied on her. Her absence reshaped the court. Her memory softened a dynasty. Her children carried forward a legitimacy that had once seemed impossible. As the centuries passed, as historians debated Richard III, as dramatists obsessed over Henry VIII, as England's identity shifted again and again, Elizabeth's figure remained just out of focus, present, necessary, but rarely centered. Perhaps that is fitting, because Elizabeth of York lived at the intersection of power and restraint, visibility and silence, agency and limitation. She did not dominate history, she steadied it. She did not command events, she absorbed their shock. And in doing so, she left behind a legacy that refuses to resolve neatly into hero or victim, pawn or architect. A legacy that continues to pull us back into the same unresolved question that followed her throughout her life, lingering now just as it did then, waiting for each new generation to decide for itself where exactly Elizabeth of York truly stands within the story that could not have unfolded without her. And that uncertainty is exactly where her presence still lives. Because when you strip away dates and titles and the neat scaffolding of dynasties, what remains of Elizabeth of York is not a clear answer but a tension that never fully releases. She occupies a space history doesn't like to linger in for too long, the space between action and consequence, between choice and inevitability. She was born into a world that expected her to be useful, not decisive, valuable, not vocal. Her earliest memories would have been shaped by movement, by households shifting from palace to palace, by adults speaking in careful tones when politics intruded into family life. Even before she could grasp the meaning of betrayal, she lived inside its aftermath. Even before she understood power, she was shaped by it. And that is why her later composure mattered so much, because England had grown tired of volatility. It had watched kings rise and fall, families fracture, loyalties flip overnight. It had seen ambition disguised as duty and cruelty justified as necessity. By the time Elizabeth became queen, the nation was desperate for something quieter, something that didn't feel like a prelude to disaster. Elizabeth felt safe, not because she was weak but because she was familiar. She was the daughter of Edward IV, a king many still remembered fondly. She carried the Yorkist identity without rage, without threat. She did not demand restoration, she offered reconciliation. That distinction made all the difference. It meant that when Henry VIII stood beside her, people didn't just see a conqueror who had seized a crown. They saw continuity. They saw a story that made sense again, even if it had been violently edited along the way. And Elizabeth never tried to undo that perception. She didn't publicly mourn the loss of Yorkist power. She didn't challenge Henry's authority. She didn't attempt to resurrect old claims or champion old grudges. Whatever she felt privately, about her brothers, about her father, about the life she might have lived in another timeline, she did not turn those feelings into politics. That restraint was not accidental, it was learned. Because Elizabeth had seen what happened to people who reached too openly for what they believed was theirs. She had watched Richard of York die in rebellion. She had watched Warwick the Kingmaker fall. She had watched her uncle Richard II seize power only to lose everything. She had learned that in her world, reaching could be fatal, so she stood instead. She stood through ceremonies, through pregnancies, through negotiations conducted over her children's futures. She stood in a court that measured her value constantly by her fertility, her obedience, her symbolic usefulness, and she fulfilled those expectations so completely that the system itself stabilized around her. And still that stability never fully protected her, because her body remained the final battleground. 7 pregnancies, 7 risks. Every confinement was a reminder that the future of a kingdom rested inside a single woman's health. Every birth was watched not only with hope but with calculation. Will this be a boy? Will this child live? Will this strengthen or weaken the crown? Elizabeth did not get to be careless. She did not get to be exhausted. She did not get to refuse. Even joy was regulated by expectation. And yet within that there are glimpses of her as a person rather than a function. The household accounts that record her interest in music, the payments to composers, the care taken in her clothing and surroundings, the presence of animals, greyhounds, hawks, suggesting moments of movement, of breath, of something like pleasure, the involvement in architectural plans at Greenwich, hinting at aesthetic preferences, imagination, taste. These are small things, but small things are often all history leaves behind of women whose lives were lived inside systems designed to erase individuality. And then there is the way people reacted when she died. That reaction matters more than any single anecdote, because grief cannot be legislated. London did not mourn Elizabeth because it was told to. It mourned because something recognizable had vanished, something that had made the Tudor experiment feel humane, something that had softened the image of a crown forged in blood. After her death, Henry VII's reign grew colder, more defensive, more insular. That contrast alone suggests how much Elizabeth had been doing simply by existing. She was not issuing orders, but she was absorbing resentment. She was not delivering speeches, but she was calming doubts. She was not rewriting law, but she was reshaping perception. And perception in politics is often the difference between acceptance and resistance. That is why Elizabeth's legacy feels so elusive. It cannot be pinned to a single reform or decree. It lives in outcomes rather than actions, in what did not happen because she was there, in wars that did not restart, in rebellions that failed to ignite fully, in claims that lost momentum because her bloodline already occupied the throne. It is a legacy defined by prevention rather than creation, and prevention rarely earns monuments. Even her tomb, beautiful as it is, tells only part of the story. Bronze effigies lying side by side suggest unity, permanence, resolution. But Elizabeth's life was never truly resolved. It was cut short at the moment when her influence might have shifted again, when her children were growing, when her authority as Queen Mother might have deepened, when her experience might have tempered the next generation. Instead, she became memory. And memory, as England would soon learn under her son, is something that can be reshaped, reinterpreted, even weaponized. Henry VIII would grow up to redefine kingship in ways Elizabeth never witnessed. He would break with Rome. He would reorder religion. He would marry and discard wives with a brutality that stunned Europe. He would reshape England's institutions and leave scars that lasted centuries. But even in his most radical acts, the legitimacy that protected him, the sense that he was unquestionably the rightful king, flowed back to Elizabeth, to her blood, to her marriage, to the quiet reconciliation she embodied. Without that foundation, even Henry VII's authority would have been more vulnerable. And so Elizabeth of York remains one of those figures who refuses to sit comfortably in simple categories. She was not a revolutionary. She was not a passive victim. She was not a ruler in her own right, and yet she ruled the tone of a kingdom during one of its most delicate transitions. Her story challenges the way we think about power. It asks whether influence must always announce itself to be real. It asks whether survival can be a form of leadership. It asks whether history sometimes turns not on the clash of armies, but on the presence of a person whose existence makes chaos harder to justify. Elizabeth of York did not end England's conflicts forever, but she closed one door long enough for the country to walk through it and lock it behind them. And the fact that her story still invites debate, that we are still unsure how much agency to grant her, how much intention to assign to her choices, is not a weakness of her legacy. It is its proof. Because only figures who truly matter leave behind questions that cannot be settled, only felt questions that hover at the edge of the narrative. quietly insisting that history is shaped not only by those who force it forward, but also by those who hold it steady just long enough for the future to take root, and that steadying force, once recognized, becomes impossible to unsee. Because when you look back across the wreckage of the 15th century, across the broken alliances, the executions, the exiles, the crowns taken and lost, you begin to notice how rare Elizabeth of York's trajectory actually was. Most figures caught in that storm were either destroyed by it or hardened into something sharp and unforgiving. Elizabeth did neither. She absorbed the violence of her era without becoming violent herself. She survived without turning survival into vengeance. That alone sets her apart. Her life did not follow a single upward arc. It zigzagged, it reversed, it collapsed and reassembled. She began as a king's daughter, then became a bargaining chip, then a threatened claimant, then a refugee in sanctuary, then a queen whose crown existed as much to reassure others as to elevate herself. At no point was her path secure for very long. Stability, when it appeared, was always provisional. And yet she adapted to each version of herself without fracturing. As a child, she learned obedience because obedience kept her alive. As a young woman, she learned restraint because restraint kept her relevant. As a queen, she learned visibility because visibility kept the peace. These were not glamorous skills. They do not translate easily into legend, but they are the skills that hold systems together when ideology fails. Elizabeth's contemporaries may not have articulated it this way, but they responded to it instinctively. Nobles who had once fought against her father accepted her husband. Courtiers who might have whispered treason found themselves hesitating. Foreign powers treated the Tudor regime with more seriousness once Elizabeth's children were born because bloodlines speak a language diplomats understand better than promises. And still, the cost of that role was personal. Elizabeth never had the luxury of disengagement. She could not retreat into private grief or private ambition. Every expression, every pregnancy, every public appearance carried political weight whether she intended it or not. Even her silences were interpreted. Even her illness became a matter of state. Her body was never just her own. That truth sits uneasily with modern sensibilities, but it is essential to understanding her story. Elizabeth was not simply living a life, she was sustaining an argument that England had moved on, an argument that York and Lancaster were no longer enemies, an argument that the future belonged to her children, not to the ghosts of past claims, and arguments require endurance. When Elizabeth died, that argument didn't end, but it did lose its most persuasive voice. Henry VIII continued to rule, but without her, his authority relied more heavily on enforcement than acceptance. Taxes grew harsher, surveillance tight. The atmosphere at court shifted. Stability remained, but it was a stability that felt imposed rather than embodied. That difference mattered, because imposed stability breeds resentment, while embodied stability invites compliance. Elizabeth had represented the latter. Her death made the former unavoidable. And yet, even then, the structure she helped build held. The Tudor dynasty survived its founder. It survived rebellions. It survived the loss of an heir. It survived religious transformation. It survived the volatility of Henry VIII himself. That survival is not accidental. It traces back to the early years when England was allowed to believe just long enough that the fighting was over. That belief took root during Elizabeth's queenship. It grew stronger with each public appearance, each child, each ceremony that reinforced the idea that this new order was not temporary. By the time doubts resurfaced in different forms, the old arguments no longer had the same force. The nation had crossed a psychological threshold. It had begun to imagine itself under a single, continuous line again. Elizabeth made that possible without ever claiming credit, and perhaps that is why her story remains so compelling. Because it resists the temptation to resolve into triumph or tragedy alone. Her life was both. It was marked by loss and limitation, yet it produced outcomes far larger than she could ever fully control. She did not get to choose the moment she was born into history, but she shaped how history moved past that moment. When we ask whether Elizabeth of York was a pawn or a player, the question itself reveals a misunderstanding. She was neither in the conventional sense. She was the board on which others moved and the boundary that kept the game from collapsing into chaos again. She was not powerless. Her power simply operated in a register that history struggles to measure. In that struggle, the difficulty of naming her influence, of defining her agency, of deciding where exactly she belongs in the hierarchy of historical importance, is precisely what keeps her story alive. It forces us to look beyond declarations and battles and ask how often the course of events turns on those who stabilize rather than disrupt, who endure rather than dominate, who make peace seem possible simply by remaining present long enough for the world to accept it as normal again. Elizabeth of York did not demand remembrance, but the shape of England after her makes forgetting her impossible. Because forgetting her would mean pretending that history moves only through force, and not through the quieter negotiations that happen inside families, marriages, bodies, and expectations. Elizabeth's life sits uncomfortably with the way power is usually taught. She didn't issue proclamations that reshaped law. She didn't lead troops onto battlefields. She didn't leave behind a personal philosophy written in her own hand. Yet when you remove her from the sequence of events, everything that follows begins to wobble. Take her marriage away and Henry VII's reign becomes far more fragile. Take her children away and the Tudor claim thins dangerously. Take her presence away from the early years of the dynasty and the sense of reconciliation that allowed England to pause after decades of violence evaporates. Elizabeth was not the spark, she was the insulation, and insulation is only noticed when it's gone. This becomes clearer when you look at how often later generations tried, consciously or not, to recreate what she represented. Henry VIII attempted to rule through control and calculation after her death, but he never found a substitute for the legitimacy she embodied. Henry VIII, in his own way, spent much of his reign chasing a similar sense of security. Through marriages meant to produce heirs, through pageantry meant to command loyalty, through religious authority meant to remove any rival source of legitimacy. But those efforts were louder, harsher, more desperate. Elizabeth had made legitimacy feel natural. Her son tried to manufacture it, and that difference rippled outward, because legitimacy that feels natural can survive mistakes. Legitimacy that feels manufactured fractures under pressure. The Tudor dynasty would endure, but not without scars, rebellions, religious divisions, executions, and fear woven into daily life. The calm Elizabeth had represented was not permanent. It was borrowed time. Still, borrowed time is time. It allowed England to transition from a medieval culture of open dynastic warfare into something more centralized, more bureaucratic, more modern. That transition was not clean or kind, but it was real. And Elizabeth stood at the threshold, anchoring one foot in the old world while quietly ushering the country into the next. Her life also exposes how deeply gender shaped power in ways that are easy to overlook. A man in her position, brother to lost kings, child of a murdered dynasty, would almost certainly have been pushed into rebellion or eliminated outright. Elizabeth was spared not because she was harmless, but because her power took a form that the political world believed it could control. That belief was both her protection and her cage. It allowed her to survive where others did not, but it also ensured that her influence would be expressed indirectly, filtered through marriage, motherhood, and symbolism rather than command. She learned to operate within that structure because the alternative was extinction, and she was very good at it. She understood ceremony, she understood when to appear and when to recede, she understood how to let others speak while her presence did the work. She understood that in a court still traumatized by civil war, calm could be more persuasive than brilliance. Those are not instincts that develop by accident. They are learned through exposure to danger. Elizabeth had lived with danger long enough to recognize its patterns. She had watched adults around her justify violence in the name of stability, only to produce more chaos. She had seen how righteous certainty hardened into tyranny. She had seen how quickly loyalty dissolved when fear entered the room. So she offered something else. She offered continuity without threat, and people accepted it because they wanted to believe in it. That desire, England's desire to believe the wars were over, is the silent partner in Elizabeth's story. Without it, her marriage would have been mean. Her coronation would have been decorative. Her children would have been targets rather than heirs. But desire alone is not enough. It needs a focus, a symbol, a person. Elizabeth became that focus. She did not demand England's faith. She simply occupied the space where that faith could settle. And when she died, the absence of that space was felt immediately, even if people could not articulate why. Because without her, the Tudor dynasty became louder about its authority, more insistent, more vigilant. And vigilance, sustained too long, hardens into suspicion. Elizabeth's presence had softened the edge of power. Her absence sharpened it. That sharpening would shape the rest of the century. It would influence how Henry VIII ruled, how nobles behaved, how dissent was treated, how religion became entangled with loyalty in ways that made disagreement dangerous. All of that unfolds later. But the conditions that allowed it to unfold trace back to the moment when the last living bridge between York and Lancaster disappeared. Elizabeth of York was that bridge. And bridges are most important not when people are standing on them, but when they are gone and the gap reopens beneath everyone's feet. Her story then is not about glory or tragedy alone. It is about function, about what she did simply by being who she was, where she was, when she was. She reminds us that history is not only driven by ambition but by exhaustion, not only by conquest but by the human desire for things to stop breaking. Elizabeth gave England a pause. And in that pause, a new world began to form, quietly, unevenly, imperfectly, around a dynasty that would dominate the next century, all because one woman survived long enough, adapted deeply enough, and embodied reconciliation convincingly enough for people to believe that the future might finally hold together this time. And that belief, once planted, took on a life of its own. Because belief does not need constant reinforcement once it becomes habit. After a time, people stop questioning it. They stop measuring every action against the memory of old wars. They begin to behave as though stability is normal, expected, even inevitable. That is when a dynasty truly succeeds, not when it wins battles, but when it convinces its subjects to stop imagining alternatives. Elizabeth of York helped make that psychological shift possible. During her lifetime, England slowly transitioned from asking who should rule to assuming that the Tudors would. That transition did not happen overnight, and it certainly did not happen cleanly. But it happened quietly, in ways that are easy to miss if you only look for moments of drama. It happened when nobles attended her coronation in numbers large enough to signal acceptance rather than fear. It happened when foreign courts treated her children as legitimate marriage prospects rather than political experiments. It happened when Yorkist resistance lost its urgency and became fragmented, nostalgic, increasingly desperate. And it happened because Elizabeth's presence allowed people to tell themselves a story that felt safer than the truth, that the violence had led somewhere, that the bloodshed had meaning, that the losses had purchased a future worth living in. That story mattered. Without it, resentment might have hardened into rebellion again. Without it, Henry VII's careful governance might have felt oppressive instead of protective. Without it, every tax, every arrest, every execution could have been interpreted as the act of an illegitimate ruler clinging to power. Elizabeth stood between the crown and that interpretation, and she did so without confrontation. This is why her role can feel frustrating to modern eyes. We are trained to look for agency in defiance, in disruption, in the refusal to comply. Elizabeth's agency took the opposite form. She complied so effectively that the system around her changed its behavior in response. That kind of influence is difficult to dramatize. It does not lend itself to decisive scenes or quotable lines. It works slowly through repetition, through familiarity, through the steady erosion of doubt. But its effects are real. After Elizabeth's death, the Tudor dynasty did not collapse. That alone is significant. In another era, the loss of a queen who embodied reconciliation might have triggered a crisis. Instead, the structure held. Not perfectly, not peacefully, but firmly enough to continue. That firmness allowed Henry VIII to inherit a throne that felt secure rather than contested. It allowed him to rule without immediately fearing usurpation. It allowed him to experiment recklessly, often disastrously, with power in ways his father never could have afforded to. And that too is part of Elizabeth's legacy, because stability can be dangerous in its own way. Once rulers stop fearing replacement, they begin to test limits. They push boundary, they assume obedience. Elizabeth had helped create a monarchy confident enough to survive, but that confidence would later mutate into excess. Still, excess does not erase origin. At the root of the Tudor century sits a woman whose life never belonged fully to herself, yet whose existence shaped the fate of nations. She did not ask to be the solution to England's civil wars. She was made into one, and she fulfilled that role so thoroughly that history almost forgot to ask how much it cost her. She lost brothers to ambition. She lost a father to time and miscalculation. She lost children to illness. She lost her own life to childbirth. And through it all, she remained what England needed her to be. That endurance, quiet, uncelebrated absolute, is what makes Elizabeth of York such a difficult figure to categorize. She defies the narratives we prefer. She does not fit neatly into hero or victim, ruler or pawn. She exists instead in the uncomfortable space where survival itself becomes consequential. Her story does not end cleanly because it was never meant to. It dissolves into the lives of her children, into the reigns that followed, into the centuries of debate about legitimacy, monarchy, and power that England would continue to wrestle with long after her name faded from common memory. And perhaps that is the most fitting legacy of all, that Elizabeth of York remains present not as a final answer, but as a quiet, persistent reminder that history is often held together by those who never get to decide whether they will carry its weight, only whether they will collapse beneath it or stand long enough for something new to take shape around them. So if history ever feels distant, if names and dates start to blur together, remember that behind every dynasty there is a human story like this one, quiet, complicated, unfinished, waiting to be felt rather than just learned. This is Profile Verse.